Hello and welcome, listeners, to Coldwell Banker Commercial Devonshire Realty's very first podcast. My name is Matt Rodriguez. I am CBCDR's Director of Marketing. I will be your facilitator, your moderator, your mediator, hopefully not mediator, and most of all, your host for this podcast. And we hope it's a very fun, interesting, and illuminating podcast. Now, before we get started, kind of what's the purpose of this podcast? A little backstory for it, for why we're making this podcast. It came out of an idea of one of our marketing meetings, and it's very much centered around, what we want it to be centered around is our clients. CBCDR has been around for 40 years now, and throughout those years, we've worked with an incredible amount of very interesting and very successful people. And the purpose behind this is, well, we want to tell you about those people. The biggest hurdle was we didn't really know how to capture it. I'm not a journalist. I didn't get a degree in any kind of media whatsoever, and I don't have any experience capturing someone's interesting points in a Q&A written column article. So I figured writing was out of the possibility. But that's when the idea was sparked in one of our meetings of trying out a podcast. So I watched a bunch of YouTube videos, trying to figure out how to start one of these. Took my boss's credit card and I went and bought a bunch of cool audio equipment. So here we are. Now the underlying tone of this podcast is kind of convey very interesting points and also be transparent. Why do we want to be interesting? That's pretty obvious. We want you to listen to our podcast. But the being transparent part is I want listeners to feel like they're engaged in the podcast. So if something funny happens in the room, someone knocks over their glass of water, I'll stop and poke fun and talk about it. We're not pros at this. There's no reason to think that we are pros, but we want to put a good product together. So here we are. So now I've got all my blabbering out of the way and have kind of set the tone for the podcast. I like to bring in my actual interesting guests. Renati, our Chief Operations Officer, references them as the Harrington Boys. So Harrington Boys, please introduce yourself to the hopefully tens of people that are listening to our podcast. Introduce yourself.
Tom Harrington Jr.
Tim Harrington.
And what are you guys' roles here at the company?
Well, my role is to oversee the commercial brokerage and property management areas and actually do production myself in the brokerage area. But that's where I spend all my time.
And I oversee the Allied Capital title operation and am active in the commercial brokerage aspect really through a relationship that I manage with Core Spaces, which is a student housing developer.
Very nice. Very nice. So I chose you two because you guys are pretty much the start of this company and are very much a big reason of why it has lasted for 40 years through ups and downs, and we can talk about those a little later. So TH, if you want to go ahead and start, I know a cool bit of history is you were CBCDR's very first agent. Is that correct?
Yes. It started as a sole proprietorship that was founded alongside of Devonshire Realty, which was really a property management and development operation that all kind of started at the same time. And that was really a result of after I had graduated from Illinois in finance real estate, really kind of inspired by our father, who was an attorney here in town. Unfortunately passed away 5 years ago, and we all miss him. But while he was an attorney, he had a great love for real estate and was very active not only as a real estate attorney but as a developer and an investor. And one of his best friends growing up, George Shapland, and he started really in the 50s meeting for lunch, and George was a general contractor at the time, and they began to develop real estate, single-family subdivisions and all types of real estate, really meeting for lunch, actually at the time at Western Bowl, about every day. And Dad, I think, did the legal work, and George did the construction, and that's how they did. They both became very busy over time, around the time that I had graduated, to where they had some of their developments were sitting a little bit idle because they had just gotten so busy with other business activities. And that was how I really went to work for them and for them and with them, and managing their developments and doing some property management for them, and at the same time got a broker's license and started the real estate brokerage business. And
so the heavy load kind of brought you into the business.
yeah, I think that's a fair way to describe it. And it was a tremendous opportunity in that they had, and deservingly, absolutely outstanding reputations, and a lot of the values of the company today are really based upon those guys always looking at how the other person would look at it, and fairness and honesty, and great opportunity, and been great guiding principles for us ever since. So and a good opportunity, obviously, for a young guy at that time, just out of school.
Great timing too.
Yes, it was pretty good timing until about 3 years later when interest rates were 20%, but that's a whole other story.
Now, Tim, when did you enter the picture?
Well, that was 1977 when TH started. So I went to school in 77 and graduated. I went to the University of Arizona. Graduated in 1981. I had worked on some summer jobs here, doing various tasks.
Tim, TH, what did you scoff at that? Why?
Tim's not known as the handiest person in the entire family, and he was working one of those in maintenance, and there's some pretty interesting stories.
Okay.
Well, it was a very valuable lesson for me because I learned that I wanted to have a desk job.
Okay, very good.
And not have to burn my clothes after taking a dead carcass out of a restaurant that had closed. So
very good.
Pretty quick education there. So, but that summer work helped me understand the business. I actually studied real estate in college and knew, just growing up, being around my father, then with TH in the business for 4 years, I developed a real desire to be in the real estate business, and knew that pretty much throughout college, and studied in real estate as a specialty, and was lucky enough in 1981 when I graduated in May of 1981. A month later, I was sitting at my desk. It was myself, brother Tom. We had at that time an assistant, Sue Gorman, and then Bill Sheridan had started because of the subdivision business. In about 1980, Bill Sheridan started with the group as well, and he was the engineer on staff working the subdivisions.
Which was the beginning of HTC engineering.
Mm-hmm. Now this, although we're just a commercial brokerage, or mostly handle commercial brokerage and commercial property management, this company was once very, very sizable. There was an engineering aspect, an architectural aspect, a residential aspect.
Well, it grew from that beginning when I came on. There was a couple major things that happened, and I'll add that I think one of the things that really sparked Tom when he first started was the acquisition of Huntington Towers. At the time, needed an on-site manager, and that's a big part of what his role was early on too in the property management, was taking on this building that they had just acquired and needed a lot of attention. So that was a big part of it.
That's probably one of the bigger buildings in Champaign back then too.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, and it's got an interesting history. That's probably a podcast in and of itself.
Sure.
But keeping to task here, in the early 80s, it was logical to expand into the residential brokerage. And it was always a separate business from the commercial. Our roots are in commercial brokerage and property management, and that's what we've always been in. We saw an opportunity with a couple existing residential companies to combine them, and I'll let TH talk a little bit more about that. But that was the early 80s when we started Devonshire Realty Residential.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that was originally a response to a need we felt within the subdivision business to perhaps better market the lots, and they developed an opportunity with Doris Higgins and a company that she owned at the time, and the Mary and Paul Hannigan and Paula Schertz And those two companies came together, and that became Devonshire Realty Residential, as it was called at the time. And that grew over time just really by opportunities with the right people that presented themselves, and it became, I think, at one point maybe the fifth largest Coldwell banker in the country. And alongside of that, the engineering business, really largely as a result of the high level of competency of Bill Sheridan and others that he pulled into the business. Notably, originally Dave Atchley was one of the first ads, and all of that was really built around providing very high levels of customer service and attention to providing a good and valuable product for different customers. So that I don't think there was originally a grand plan, but it just sort of evolved, and we tried to plan along the way, and we had a lot of good times with a lot of good people through all that, and most all of those acquisitions, and there was probably, or affiliations, there was probably 25 or more of them, probably more. They were all really in reaction to good people, and certainly through that length of time, which it's now been 40 years, there were certainly major economic cycles through all that.
Sure.
One key element in the residential side of the business was the decision in 1995 to affiliate with Coldwell Banker.
Because originally you guys, it was just called Devonshire Group.
Devonshire Realty Residential was a separate
sure.
real estate company. We always operated commercial as Devonshire Realty.
But not as a Coldwell Banker office, just simply as Devonshire Realty.
That's correct. And we stayed independent commercially until 1999, when some changes occurred with the commercial side of the brand that we felt made it a fit for us. And that's actually been a very good marriage for us and allowed us to grow regionally. But the Coldwell Banker name residentially in 95 started with an acquisition of an existing Coldwell Banker firm in Champaign, and then led to pretty rapid regional growth starting in 2000 in Peoria and Springfield. And so that became overnight a pretty sizable Coldwell Banker franchise operation. TH mentioned one of the largest in the country. And eventually we grew to acquire a pretty sizable residential company in Jacksonville, Florida, in that area. So we operated that business until the Great Recession, which we'll talk more about.
Yeah, of 08. Yeah.
08, 09, yep.
One interesting aside, because we didn't mention it earlier, but the Devonshire name actually was a result of perhaps some laziness on my part, in that there was one of the original subdivisions that Tom Sr. and George developed was Devonshire Subdivision, and that was
on Harrington Drive, no, or that was Devonshire too.
Devonshire
right?
Drive, and then later Harrington Drive, and that really was named after the county in England where George Chaplin's family was originally from, and they liked the idea of calling a subdivision that because they could find street names in the London phone book. So, and then the reason that it kind of transferred down to the brokerage and to where it still is part of the name today is because when I went to work for them in '77, they had kept a separate phone line for the residential lot sales that was listed in the phone book under Devonshire Realty. So the path of least resistance was just to use that phone number and already listing in the phone book. The
other thing that happened in the mid-'90s, so the '90s were a pretty rapid growth time. The engineering company merged with Alltech, which was a pretty sizable and old line. Its roots were old line in the community in the engineering world. So we combined those two companies in 1995, and that operation grew significantly from that acquisition through again into the 2000s and early 2000s.
Ultimately adding architecture with Architectural Spectrum, well-respected local firm, taking the whole group into the architecture arena as well.
So it's 2008. All of a sudden, a bomb drops on pretty much the entire country. The company kind of had to go in a different direction than what it had grown into. Or not really a different direction, more going back to the roots of what you originally did, what you guys were best at, and that was commercial real estate. You guys...
Yeah, we had to dramatically downsize.
Sure.
I mean, the acquisition in the Jacksonville, Florida markets was actually after the recession had started there, and was probably a pretty well-conceived idea. Other than then following that, Illinois began to follow suit, and the recovery in Florida was much, much longer than anyone thought. So it resulted in the need for dramatically downsizing, which we did, and tried to help everyone involved land on their feet, and I think was largely successful with that. And so then it was time to grow the commercial real estate business and the title business, from there.
Mm-hmm. And TH is talking about the title business, the ACT, Allied Capital Title, which is on the first floor of our building, which we have affiliation with as well. And now we're here, 2017, 40 years later. Are you happy with where we are?
Oh, I think so. I mean, it's a great group, and it's in a growth mode, and so yes, I think
Yeah, I'm
so.
having fun, and that's a big part of it, is who you work with, and there's a common theme throughout the history of the company, and we still believe in it now, and it's really all about the people. That's just a common theme, and when you love coming into work each day and you enjoy the people that you work with, that makes things go very well on a daily basis. So yeah, we're very happy with where we are, and the interesting thing that's occurred in the last, call it 5 years, is the company's gotten a lot younger.
No thanks to us.
No thanks to us. We haven't helped that cause, but it's interesting. We've been able to attract a number of the new generation, both in terms of brokers and in the property management world, and that's been fun for me to see, to coach some of the younger generation. It's part of my role is to assist them in understanding the business and in growing their business, which essentially is what they have. Each of the brokers has their own business to work on and grow, and so that's probably the biggest thing today that I get satisfaction out of is watching those individuals evolve.
That's great. Kind of, the recession, withstanding. What's something that you look back and you're like, man, that was something that real tough that we, either you guys overcame as a team or as a company, or individually. What's something you guys overcame and had a big bearing on you?
Well, that's one that's seared into our memory. So everything else
sure is pales in comparison. Sure, it's tough.
Because at the same time, we had a number of, in our real estate ownership area and development, we had almost equal challenges. And I think one of the things that we learned from all of that is the importance of how you deal with people when you're in a situation like that. And I think probably one of the things, as we've talked about it, that we're most proud of is our resilience in that regard, and learning through that experience. A lot of it shows your character, and I think one of the things I'm proud of is, if you ask anybody we dealt with in that time frame, I think they'll tell you that we did what we could do, and we're very straightforward in our approach.
Very good, very good. So it's story time. I know brokers love to tell stories. They have no shortage of them. Every time, I remember the first time I ever went to a broker conference. It was an ICSC conference up in Chicago, and I went. It was nothing but brokers, and it was me, this lowly little marketing guy, and around the table, all the brokers, they just couldn't stop telling stories. It was, of course, I'm sitting there. I have no stories to tell. So I know you guys got some good stories. What's a story, and I'll start with Tim. What's a story that you looked around, you were in a situation, you looked around, and you said, what the hell am I doing here? Why am I here in this situation right now?
I'm sure there's a number of them. The one that sticks out in my mind was, this was a number of years ago, and I had a pretty sizable building listed, and it had a lot of different uses, but it was mainly utilized for office, maybe light industrial. And I had a group that wanted to see it over a holiday weekend, which...
Bold claim for a holiday weekend.
Yes, but being the customer service guy I am, of course, I leave my party at my house, I'm sure, and go out on I think it was a 4th of July weekend, and agreed to show this group the building because I wanted to, honor my commitment to the client that owned it, knowing in the back of my head that this church group probably wasn't a likely candidate, but you never know. So, open the building. They're looking through the building. It becomes more obvious to me that they probably don't have the means. It's a pretty sizable building and would require a significant financial commitment. But as I recall, although they didn't have the money, they wanted to ask God, I think, to help him. So
I wanted to pray on
it. Before I knew it, I was in a circle in the middle of the building where I was asked to join in prayer to ask the good Lord to provide the funds for them to buy the building. And I was looking around the circle thinking to myself, while everybody was at my house having a good time, what the hell am I doing here? So that one sticks in my mind. And no, they didn't buy the building, but it did sell, and that all ended up okay.
You got a good story out of it too.
Yes.
Got to be part of a good prayer circle. TH, what about yourself?
Oh, I'll go back to very early on, and Tim alluded to, the property management role at Huntington Towers, and I was in the office, and it was just myself and the assistant at that time, and of course this was a Saturday morning, so the assistant, Sue Gorman, was obviously not there, but there was a restaurant that had just opened maybe a month before on the 12th floor, called the Autumn Tree, which was actually exceedingly popular to begin with, and was running at a very high volume, but it had really just been it had been empty space where they had remodeled, or actually built it out originally as a restaurant. And so it was about mid-morning, and there was a law firm on the first floor, and the phone rang, and I picked it up, and they said, yes, this is the law firm down on the first floor of the building, and it's raining inside. I said, excuse me? They said, you should come down here. So I go down there, and sure enough, it is pretty much raining through the ceiling tile on the first floor. And so I could not figure out how that could have possibly happened. Well, it turned out that the restaurant on the top floor had probably had some of its pipes that weren't working so well, and had caused a backup on the some of the drainage systems. So I was trying to figure out the source of it, and it appeared that it was coming out of some water fountains that were on the first floor, and maybe if I could get that stopped, then I'd stop the rainfall. So I found some concrete blocks and some pieces of rubber and put it over that, and sure enough, it stopped. Until it backed it up further, and it started raining on the second and the third floor.
Oh, so you were lucky initially. Basically, going from the 12th to the first floor, it didn't hit any of the previous floors until then.
Yes. So it was quite a mess, and I had fortunately it called Roto-Rooter before I started my own cure. So eventually it was stopped. But there was a lot of interesting stories from those days.
Autumn Tree had quite a history, and the building wasn't really designed for having that kind of a disposal. And I remember another time similar to that where one of our great maintenance guys from the past, Dick Getman, who was quite a character, but would do anything for you and anything for the job. Same thing, there was a backup on the Autumn Tree in that space, and so they had to check and see where it was coming from. On the 9th floor, there was an opening of the line for the sewer. Well, as I recall, when I went down to the floor, Dick Getman had opened that up and had
It's a clean out.
It was a clean out. So once he opened it, he was covered with green slime.
Oh, gross.
It was pretty bad.
So poor Dick. He took one for the team.
So you guys own various properties around Champaign and elsewhere. Some together, some individually. What's the most fun project you guys have had working on together? Very much of a team atmosphere.
I'll let Tim, one of the most interesting, certainly, we discussed this a little bit earlier. I'll let Tim tell the story. But it was an interesting asset. It was real estate related, I would call it. But Tim, why don't you...
Cemeteries?
Yeah.
I'm glad you mentioned that because I had a specific request about the cemetery, and so if you weren't going to bring it up, I was going to ask for the story.
On the theme of what the hell am I doing here, we had a good friend of ours that saw an opportunity, and he called us and said, "You got to come down here and listen to this. We think that he thought there'd be an opportunity." He always was kind of helping us look at different opportunities. So we go down to a meeting, and he introduced us to a cemetery, it was a cemeterian, which I'd never heard that term. And he popped up and said, "Gentlemen, I'm a cemeterian." So we ended up listening to the idea, and the idea was to acquire existing cemeteries in town, Mount Hope and Woodlawn and Roselawn. And so, we were kind of intrigued by it. So I didn't know you could own cemeteries. And so not knowing what the heck we were doing, but being entrepreneurial in spirit, we decided, all right, we're going to do this. And so we acquired those cemeteries, and so we were kind of kiddingly from cradle to grave, so to speak, full service real estate operation.
Oh, that's...
So we operated those for a few years, learned a pretty good lesson that we should stick to our basics because it was really an operating business, and fortunately in that time when we decided that perhaps we should stick to what we know.
Should
we
exit
decided
the
to
cemetery
sell
market.
Yes, we hired a company that specialized, believe it or not, in that, and there was a consolidation in the industry, and we were fortunate that due to that consolidation, there were some major players that wanted to acquire cemeteries around the country, and so we ended up selling it to that group, and there was a happy ending to one where we again looked at ourselves and said, what have we done here? So good experience.
So you guys got really lucky on that one.
I'd call it really lucky.
They dodged you out on that one.
Timing's not always good, but sometimes it is.
Sometimes it's impeccable, and that's an example of impeccable timing.
Yes.
Any other good stories that you have for us?
Well, one of my favorites is I don't know if TH can keep it rather clean, but one of my favorite is the Huntington Tower story where when he managed it on his own, he had to have an elderly person had to be helped out of the building and go into a home because she couldn't care for herself. And I'll let TH kind of go through the rest of it, but it had an interesting ending to the extent that when she was leaving, the police had to intervene and help just simply because she had nowhere to go. So he had to seek their assistance, and he knew the policeman that was assisting in that, and I'll let him finish.
Yeah, well, yes. Well, there was a major fire here actually in the building at the time, and another interesting aspect of that was that we had some real local ingenuity, and it was the building is wired with a system called a duck bus, and that is a transmission system that is designed specifically for a building, so it's not something that you replace easily. In fact, the lead time is probably 6 months. So,
oh wow!
The building was rewired in 3 days by using temporarily underground electric cable like you'd put in a subdivision, and so it's pretty interesting in that regard. But what Tim's referring to is there was a number of apartments, probably 80 at that time, in the building were apartment units, and there was an elderly woman that lived on one of the floors, and we of course had to evacuate everybody and put them for several days in a hotel, which we did. But we came to find out in going into her apartment that sadly she had was in very poor health, and the apartment was pretty disgusting, and she'd pretty much lost control of her bowels, and so it wasn't good. And it became clear that she needed some help, so they couldn't find any family members, and somehow we ended up getting her admitted into the hospital. But through this process, I somehow ended up as at least the person of contact, and somehow the only person that involved with her. So eventually the building opened back up. She got released from the hospital, and in that process we had installed new floors, and she had a small fall as a result of another accident, if you will, and had to go be taken back really a bit against her will to the hospital. And so I had to sign some papers to have her taken back to the hospital, and the county sheriffs do that. And so I'll paraphrase here, but I knew those deputies, and I saw them in a local tavern not too long after that, and they said, come over here and start buying us beer. And I said, well, I'm happy to, but why? And they said, well, that woman that you had taken into the hospital? I said, yeah. She said, well, our squad's not been the same since because of what she did in the back seat of it, so I'll leave it to your imagination. So, never a dull moment.
Soiled the squad car.
Oh no.
Oh well.
Well, at least you were a very helpful gentleman to that lady, so I'm sure she appreciated that.
One of the things I wanted to mention that probably are my favorite memories of the company, just in the years back, are the Christmas parties. And
I've heard about these Christmas parties.
We were really excited about what those meant every year to a larger group of people in the community, and they were a lot of fun, and were the place to be for the Christmas party of the year, and a lot of great memories. And one of the traditions that started out of that was interesting is our mom one year early on decided that ties weren't appropriate, that people should relax at these parties, and so she took to cutting off ties. So anybody that showed up with a tie, she would cut the tie off. So there were several years in a row where unsuspecting people came into the Christmas party and were subject to her cutting the tie off. So that was just a part of the party, but they were a lot of fun, and we had people from around the community that looked forward to those, and we had a long stretch of those Christmas parties, and of course times change, and but at their peak they were semi-legendary.
They were talk of the town.
Yes.
Well, guys, I'm sure you guys could go on for hours and hours and hours telling us about your stories, but we'll go ahead and end that on a good note of a nice Christmas party. So thank you for joining me. I really appreciate your time and your stories, and hopefully our listeners enjoyed them too. So thank you for listening to our first CBCDR podcast. More to come. Thank you very much.